Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into some pretty intense stuff. We're talking USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. And the material you sent over, wow, it's definitely making me rethink a few things. We've got an interview here with someone claiming to be a whistleblower, someone on the inside, spilling the beans about USAID's activities. And let me tell you, if even half of what they're saying is true, this is some seriously wild stuff. We're talking taxpayer dollars, yours and mine, potentially being used in ways you wouldn't believe. We're talking possible influence on media outlets, even the potential toppling of foreign governments. There's even a mention of a possible connection to the Panama Papers. Remember that whole thing? The offshore tax haven expose? Yeah, wild stuff. So basically, our mission for this deep dive is to figure out what USAID is really up to. Are they the benevolent force for good they claim to be? Or is there something more going on here? Something a little more, shall we say, strategic? And if so, what does that mean for U.S. foreign policy? What does it mean for international relations? This is a big one, folks, so buckle up. Before we get too deep into the weeds of this whistleblower's claims, though, let's take a step back. I think it's important to make sure we're all on the same page here. So, just to start us off, can you remind us what exactly is USAID? What's they're supposed to be doing?
You're right. It's always good to start with the basics. USAID's been around for a while. It was actually created back in 1961 by President Kennedy. And initially, their focus was more on traditional humanitarian aid, things like food aid after disasters, helping out with health initiatives, primarily in developing countries. But as time went on, things evolved. And USAID's role has definitely become much more, well, complex. These days, they're a lot more intertwined with promoting U.S. interests abroad. It's all part of this idea of soft power. So instead of relying solely on military might, soft power is all about influencing other countries through, diplomacy, economic assistance, and promoting American values and culture. USAID plays a significant role in that, funding programs related to all sorts of things, from democracy and governance to economic growth, education, health, even conflict prevention.
Okay, so on the surface, it all sounds, well, pretty reasonable, right? Promoting democracy, helping those in need. But our whistleblower here, they paint a very different picture. They claim there's this secrecy doctrine that governs USAID's operations, and they allege that the real goal, well, it's not so much about goodwill. They call it, and I'm quoting here, organized political warfare. That's a pretty loaded phrase.
Definitely raises some questions. How much do we really know about what goes on behind the scenes? Of course, in any foreign policy operation, there's always going to be this tension between transparency and national security. Some things, they might need to be kept under wraps for legitimate reasons, but when secrecy becomes the norm, it can be a slippery slope. It can erode public trust and make it harder to hold people accountable. And, well, it can potentially even lead to abuses of power. So it's a delicate balance.
Right. And speaking of potential abuses of power, one of the things that really jumped out at me in the source material was this description of USAID's judicial reform programs. It sounds like something that could very easily be, well, manipulated.
Absolutely. It's a really important point. Judicial reform. On the surface, it sounds great. A fair and impartial judiciary, it's essential for any democracy to function properly, right?
Yeah.
Protects human rights, ensures the rule of law, all that good stuff. So you could see how USAID funding could be used to train judges, improve court infrastructure, even support legal reforms that, strengthen justice systems around the world. But there's always a but, isn't there? That same funding could also be used to, well, exert political influence. Instead of promoting genuine judicial independence, you can imagine a scenario where aid is used to pressure courts to favor U.S. interests, to maybe go after political opponents, or even to, well, to undermine the systems they're supposed to be supporting. It's a complicated issue.
Definitely a lot of gray area there. Okay, so we're already getting into some pretty murky territory. And it gets even murkier when you look at what the whistleblower alleges about USAID's involvement in media. They describe this example of USAID's investing $20 million in investigative journalism. And the result, billions in fines, major policy changes, even arrests and the toppling of a foreign government. I mean, I'm all for exposing corruption, holding the powerful accountable, absolutely. But this sounds less like journalism and more like, well, I don't know, weaponized information. What do you think?
It certainly makes you think. It raises questions about the line between supporting independent media and using it as a tool to maybe advance a specific agenda. Was this genuine investigative journalism leading to positive change? Or was it something more, well, orchestrated,
Yeah.
more manipulative. To really understand what was going on, we'd need a lot more information. How were those funds used? Who was involved? What were the intended outcomes? It all comes back to that issue of transparency. Without more information, it's impossible to say for sure what was really going on.
Right. And that lack of transparency makes it even harder to figure out, are these activities actually aligned with USAID's mission, or are they venturing into more, shall we say, questionable territory?
Exactly. And speaking of questionable territory, the source material also mentions a specific media organization that was allegedly involved. The Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, the OCCRP. This organization, they have a pretty solid reputation in the world of investigative journalism. They've won a ton of awards, and they've been involved in exposing some major international scandals, including the Panama Papers.
Oh, yeah, the Panama Papers, that was huge. So what's the connection to USAID?
Well, according to the whistleblower, the OCCRP is basically a front for USAID.
Well, hold on. A front. You mean like USAID is secretly pulling the strings, using them to advance their own agenda?
That's the implication. And it wouldn't be the first time something like this has happened. There have been examples in the past of intelligence agencies using seemingly independent organizations to, spread propaganda or influence events behind the scenes. Think back to all those Cold War era revelations about the CIA infiltrating media outlets and cultural groups.
Right, right. It's all starting to sound a little, well, cloak and dagger. But if an organization like the OCCRP, with their reputation for solid investigative journalism, if they're potentially being used as a tool for political influence, it really makes you question everything, doesn't it? How do you know what's real anymore? How do you separate fact from, well, a carefully constructed narrative? It's a lot to think about.
It is, and it's a question we should all be asking ourselves these days. We're bombarded with information from all sides. We have to be more critical consumers of information. Think about the source. Consider the potential biases and seek out multiple perspectives. It's not easy, but it's more important than ever.
Okay, so it sounds like we need to be, I don't know, maybe a little less trusting, a little more suspicious of everything.
Not necessarily suspicious, but definitely more discerning. It's about developing our critical thinking skills, not just accepting everything we read or hear at face value.
I can get behind that. Don't just blindly trust. Question everything. But if we're talking about organizations like USI operating in the shadows, how are we supposed to even know what questions to ask?
That's a great question, and it brings us to the heart of the issue: transparency and accountability. If these organizations are truly working to promote democracy and human rights around the world, then they should be open about their activities and willing to be scrutinized.
All right, I'm ready to dig deeper. Let's talk specifics. How do these alleged covert operations actually work? What kind of impact are they having on the global stage? I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've laid out some pretty serious allegations. Potential manipulation of judicial systems, media being used as a tool for political influence, even the possibility of organizations like the OCCRP being fronts for covert operations. This is a lot to unpack. I mean, where do we even begin to untangle all of this?
You're right. It's a lot to digest. And it's important to remember, we're dealing with allegations here. We need more than just this one source to really confirm these claims and to fully understand, the extent of what might be going on. But what we can do is start, digging into some specific examples from the whistleblower's account, see if they hold up under scrutiny.
Okay, yeah. Let's start there. So the whistleblower talks about USAID's involvement in the downfall of, well, I guess we can't name names, but a particular foreign government. And they specifically point to the media as playing a key role in this. What can you tell us about that?
So the whistleblower is claiming that USA funneled millions of dollars to media outlets and journalists in this country. And they allege that this funding was basically used to produce a series of investigative reports that exposed corruption within the government. And these reports, according to the source, led to, well, widespread public outrage, protests, and ultimately the collapse of the regime.
Wow. Sounds like something out of a movie. But how do we know if that's actually what happened? I mean, couldn't it just be a coincidence that USAID was funding media development programs in this country at the same time that the government was facing all these corruption allegations?
That's a valid point. That's one of the challenges with these situations, isn't it? It can be tough to establish a direct causal link between USAID's funding and specific political outcomes. But what we can do is look for patterns, connect the dots, as they say.
Okay, so what kind of patterns are we talking about?
Well, the whistleblower claims that this isn't an isolated incident. They say USAI has used similar tactics in other countries, funneling money to media outlets and NGOs that are critical of governments that the U.S. considers to be, well, unfriendly or adversarial.
So it's not just about promoting democracy and good governance, but also about, advancing U.S. interests, even if that means undermining governments that don't align with those
That
interests.
seems to be the implication, yes.
Yeah.
And it definitely raises some questions about the ethics of using foreign aid in this way.
For sure. If we're going to use taxpayer dollars to support democracy and development around the world, shouldn't it be done in a way that's, I don't know, transparent, accountable? And shouldn't we be focusing on supporting genuine grassroots movements and independent organizations rather than, trying to manipulate events from behind the scenes?
I think those are all excellent points. And it highlights the need for, well, for a more robust system of oversight when it comes to USAID's activities. We need to make sure these programs are actually aligned with U.S. values and that they're not being used to undermine democracy or interfere in the internal affairs of other countries.
Okay, so let's go back to this specific example. This government that was allegedly toppled with USAID's help. What kind of evidence does a whistleblower actually provide to support these claims?
Well, they point to specific grants that were given to media outlets and journalists in this country. And they claim that the content produced by these outlets was, highly critical of the government, and that it played a key role in, mobilizing public opinion against the regime.
Okay, but couldn't you argue that, USAID was simply supporting independent media and it was the journalists themselves who chose to focus on these corruption scandals? I mean, isn't investigative journalism supposed to hold those in power accountable?
Absolutely. And it's one of those nuances we have to consider. We need to distinguish between genuine investigative journalism that's aimed at exposing wrongdoing and media manipulation that's designed to achieve a specific political outcome. And that, well, that can be a very fine line to walk.
So how do we even determine which side of the line we're on in this case? How do we know if this was a legitimate example of investigative journalism or, well, something more, sinister?
Well, one way is to look at the content itself. Were the reports based on solid evidence? Did they give the government a chance to respond to the allegations? Were they fair and balanced in their reporting? These are all things to consider.
Okay, so we're talking about evaluating the quality of the journalism, but what about the funding? Even if the reporting was top-notch, if the money came from USAID with strings attached, that would still raise some ethical concerns, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, and that's where transparency becomes crucial. If USI is funding media outlets overseas, they should be upfront about it. No secret deals, no hidden agendas. It's about maintaining integrity.
Agreed. Transparency is key. But even if everything was above board, even if the funding was transparent and the journalism was solid, there's still the question of whether it's appropriate for USA to even be involved in this kind of activity in the first place. I mean, shouldn't we be letting other countries sort of figure out their own political systems without our interference?
It's a valid point, and it gets to the heart of the debate about the role of the U.S. in the world. Some people believe the U.S. has a responsibility to promote democracy and human rights globally, even if that means getting involved in other countries' internal affairs. Others believe we should focus on our own issues and let other countries sort things out for themselves. It's a complex issue.
So no easy answers there. It's a complex issue with a lot of different perspectives. But what I'm hearing is, even if we accept that there are times when it's, I don't know, appropriate for USA to get involved in promoting democracy and good governance overseas, there needs to be more transparency and accountability in how they do it.
Yeah. I think that's a fair assessment. We need to ensure that USAID's activities are truly aligned with U.S. values and that they're not being used to undermine democracy or to advance, well, narrow political interests.
Okay, so we've gone down the rabbit hole of USAID-funded media, and it's definitely raised more questions than answers. But there's another aspect of this story that I'm really curious about. The claim that the OCCRP, this highly respected investigative journalism network, might actually be a front for USA. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. But it's important to approach this, critically. The whistleblower's allegations are serious, but we have to consider the evidence carefully and, well, avoid jumping to conclusions. It's about being thorough.
Agreed. So let's start with the basics. What is the OCCRP? What kind of work do they do?
The OCCRP, it stands for the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. It's a global network of investigative journalists who collaborate on cross-border investigations into corruption and organized crime. Huh. They've been around for about 2 decades and they have a solid reputation for producing high-quality, impactful journalism. They're well-respected in the field.
Yeah, I've read some of their work. They were instrumental in exposing the Panama Papers, right? That whole scandal with the offshore tax havens and hidden wealth.
Exactly. The Panama Papers investigation, it was a huge collaborative effort, journalists from all over the world. And the OCCRP played a key role, coordinating the effort, publishing the findings. It was a massive scoop, and it had a major impact on global finance and politics.
Okay, so we're talking about a serious organization with a proven track record of, exposing corruption at the highest levels. So how does USAID fit into all of this?
Well, that's where the whistleblowers' claims come in. They allege that USAID has been secretly funding the OCCRP for years and using it as a tool to advance U.S. interests by, targeting individuals and governments that the U.S. considers to be adversaries.
Whoa, hold on. So if that's true, it would mean that USAID is basically using a well-respected journalistic organization as a front for, well, covert operations. That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, and it's important to note that the OCCRP has very strongly denied these allegations. They've called them, and I'm quoting here, completely false and without merit. They maintain that they are an independent organization and that they receive funding from a variety of sources, including foundations, governments, and individual donors.
Okay, so we have two very different versions of events here. On one hand, you've got the whistleblower claiming that the OCCRP is a front for USAID, and on the other hand, you have the OCCRP denying any such connection. How do we make sense of this? Who do we believe?
Right. That's the challenge. It's important to, approach these kinds of situations with a healthy dose of skepticism. Scrutinize the evidence. Consider the motives of those involved, and be aware of potential biases. It's about being, discerning.
Okay, so let's start with the whistleblower. What's their motivation here? Could they have an axe to grind? Are they trying to discredit USAID or the OCCRP for some reason? What's their angle?
It's definitely a possibility. Whistleblowers, they often have, complex motivations. It could be a sense of moral outrage, a desire to, expose wrongdoing, maybe even a personal grudge. It's important to understand the context of their claims
Right.
and consider whether they might have an agenda of their own.
Fair point. But what about the OCCRP? Why would they deny these allegations so forcefully if they were true? Don't they have something to lose by being associated with USAID, especially if it involves, covert operations?
Absolutely. If the OCCRP is truly an independent organization, being linked to a government agency, especially one involved in intelligence gathering, would really damage their credibility, their reputation. It could jeopardize their funding and make it harder for them to operate effectively. So yeah, it makes sense that they would deny the allegations, whether they're true or not.
Okay, so it makes sense for them to deny it. Doesn't necessarily mean they're telling the truth.
Exactly. We need to go beyond their denials and look at the evidence. What kind of proof does the whistleblower actually offer to back up their claims? Are there any documents, emails, financial records that, corroborate their story? We need to see the receipts, as they say.
Right. Receipts. What evidence, I ask there?
Well, they claim to have, insider knowledge of USAID's funding mechanisms. They say they've seen documents that prove the agency has been channeling money to the OCCRP through a series of, intermediaries, like foundations and other NGOs. They also allege that USAID officials have been involved in, directing the OCCRP's investigative work, suggesting topics and targets for their investigations. It's a pretty detailed account.
That's a lot. But how do we even know if these documents are authentic? And even if they are, how do we know they're not being, misinterpreted or taken out of context?
Those are all important questions. And it highlights the need for independent verification. We need journalists and researchers to dig into these claims, to examine the evidence, talk to sources on both sides of the story. It's about getting the full picture.
So we're talking about a full-blown investigation here. It's starting to sound like, I don't know, a real conspiracy.
I wouldn't go that far just yet. It's important to remember we're still talking about allegations, but it's definitely a story that, it deserves further scrutiny. The implications are huge. If it turns out that USI is using the OCCRP as a front for covert operations, it would raise serious questions about the agency's ethics, the integrity of investigative journalism, and, the role of the U.S. in global affairs.
Yeah.
This isn't just a small thing.
Okay, I'm starting to get a headache just thinking about all the layers of this, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. We need to focus on the evidence. And so far, we've only heard one side of the story. Are any other journalists or news organizations looking into this? What efforts are being made to investigate these allegations?
Yes. Actually, several reputable news organizations have picked up on this story, and they're conducting their own investigations. They're digging into the whistleblower's claims, talking to sources at USAID and the OCCRP, trying to obtain the documents that the whistleblower alleges exist. It's good to see people taking this seriously.
That's good news. Hopefully their investigations will shed more light on this. Help us get to the bottom of what's really going on.
I hope so too. In the meantime, it's important to stay informed and keep an open mind. We have to be wary of both, blind acceptance, A&D, knee-jerk dismissal. This is a complex issue with a lot of moving parts, and it's going to take time and careful analysis to sort it all out.
You've definitely given us a lot to think about. We went from talking about soft power and USAID's stated mission to, allegations of covert operations and media manipulation. It's a far cry from the image of USAID as a benevolent force for good in the world, isn't it?
It is, and it highlights the importance of, critical thinking and questioning assumptions. We can't just take things at face value. We need to dig deeper, ask tough questions, demand transparency from those in power. It's about being engaged and informed.
Agreed. So where do we go from here? What are the next steps? And what can our listener do to, stay informed and maybe even get involved in this whole conversation?
Let's explore that in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've uncovered some pretty unsettling possibilities about USAID's operations, from potentially manipulating judicial systems to maybe even using media as a tool for political influence. It's a lot to process.
Yeah, it is. And uncovering those potential issues, that's really just the first step. Now we have to figure out what can we do about it.
Right, if anything.
Exactly. And that's where things get, even trickier. We're talking about a powerful government agency. With a global reach. It's not like we can just, pick up the phone and demand answers.
True. But we can't just, throw up our hands and say, well, that's just how the world works. There has to be some way to, hold them accountable.
There is. And it starts with, awareness. The more people know about these potential issues, the more pressure we can put on those in power to actually address them. That's why, these deep dives, they're so important. We're raising awareness, encouraging critical thinking, and hopefully empowering people to demand better.
Okay, yeah. Knowledge is power, that's what they say, right? But what can we actually do with this knowledge? How do we, translate awareness into action? What are the next steps?
Well, there are a few things we can do. First, we can support organizations that are working to promote transparency and accountability in government. There are watchdog groups, investigative journalists, legal advocacy organizations. They're constantly pushing for greater oversight of agencies like USAID.
Okay, so supporting the folks who are already on the front lines, fighting the good fight. What else?
We can also contact our elected officials. Let them know that we care about these issues. They're the ones who ultimately control the purse strings and set the policies that govern these agencies. The more they hear from their constituents, the more likely they are to take action.
I guess that makes sense. But sometimes it feels like, contacting your congressman is kind of like, shouting into the void. Does it really make a difference?
I hear you. It can feel that way sometimes. But remember, those drops in the bucket, they add up. And our elected officials, they work for us. They're supposed to represent our interests. If enough people speak up, they have to listen.
Okay, so support watchdog groups, bug our elected officials. Anything else?
Absolutely. We can also just, engage in conversations with our friends, our family, our colleagues. Spread the word, share articles, discuss these issues. The more we talk about it, the more it becomes, part of the public consciousness. And that's how we create real change, lasting change.
Yeah, I like that. Let's not let this be just another headline that people forget about next week. Let's keep the conversation going.
Exactly. And it's not just about USA. It's about the bigger picture, about how power operates in the world, and about the role we all play in holding those in power accountable, no matter where they are, no matter what they're doing.
It's about, demanding better from the people in charge, right?
Exactly. It's about creating a world where power is used responsibly and where everyone has a voice, everyone has a seat at the table.
Now that's a world I want to live in. And this deep dive, it definitely feels like a step in the right direction.
Well said. And I hope this conversation I hope it's given you some food for thought.
Absolutely. To our listener, we encourage you to keep digging, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a more just and a more transparent world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.